Coming up on this episode, are the Warriors about to completely change the fabric of their team and make a shock move for Zach LaVine? I'll discuss the latest on the two-time All-Star and what it would mean for the Warriors for the rest of the season and moving forward. Welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast. The Warriors play the Suns later today. It's sure to be a huge matchup as the Warriors look for a third straight win for the first time in over 2 months. Looking forward to that, but I won't actually be able to do a post-game live, unfortunately, because soon after the game I've got to get out and have a few cold ones on a Saturday night. So looking forward to that. It's just gone 7:30 my time here in Australia, Saturday morning, and I've woke up to a major report from Brett Siegel of Clutch Points, which, first of all, I want to preface that any trade rumors, trade reports this time of year, I want to see and hear stuff from The Athletic, ESPN, and NBA insider Mark Stein. They're kind of the three major sources that I certainly look at. But Brett clearly does so much hard work and time and effort into what he does. And so what he's done here with a huge, significant trade report on so many different names, on so many different team situations, it's certainly worth a huge discussion from a Warriors standpoint because some of the things in here are really interesting. Now, the first bit, before I get onto the Zach LaVine thing, just want to mention Jimmy Butler, to which Siegel, quote here, says, there is a common thinking that the idea of Butler going to the Warriors is just a bunch of smoke, as one Western Conference executive told Clutch Points. Now, this, to me, is great news because I've said over recent days, since Jimmy Butler kind of was renewed as a trade target, a possible trade target for the Warriors, earlier in the week, it was, Tuesday, I think, US time, that Butler really re-emerged as a possible target for the Warriors. I've said since then, I just do not want Jimmy Butler. I think the cons outweigh the pros. I think giving up Andrew Wiggins in a trade for Jimmy Butler would be silly. And from what I've heard from you guys on our post-game live chats, from what I've heard and read on social media, from what we hear in terms of Steph Curry and Steve Kerr questioning whether the fit of Jimmy Butler from a locker room presence standpoint would be good in Golden State. They seem to have some hesitancy around that. Kevin O'Connor of Yahoo Sports reported that yesterday. So it sounds like everyone is kind of in agreement here that a Jimmy Butler to Golden State trade would just not work for a multitude of different reasons. So I'm incredibly happy to hear that this is just a bunch of smoke and maybe the Heat trying to increase their leverage with other teams and trying to make up that the Warriors are interested. It must be said, Anthony Slater and Marcus Thompson, The Athletic, on Wednesday, I think it was, did say that there was some level of interest there from the Warriors in terms of the Jimmy Butler trade. But I'm very thankful as someone that doesn't really want Jimmy Butler on my team, at least not for Andrew Wiggins and the other pieces that it would take. This is good news, I think, from a Warrior perspective. Now, the thing that I want to get into, because I don't want to particularly talk about Butler, because I don't want Butler on the team, Zach LaVine. Now, this has been obviously a huge discussion point for Warrior fans. We've discussed it plenty in our post-game live show after the win over the Oklahoma City Thunder the other day. Now, I think that there's a similar line of thinking here that if Zach LaVine, who's making $43 million this season, if he requires Andrew Wiggins, then that's just a no-go from a Golden State perspective. Andrew Wiggins is so valuable to the Warriors in what he does in terms of his three-point shooting, his athleticism, most importantly, though, his defense. And really, if you traded Wiggins for LaVine, yeah, you'd see an offensive upgrade, but you'd also probably see a pretty significant defensive downgrade, particularly if you're also including Gary Payton II in such a deal and not having his defensive presence there. So, to me, trading Andrew Wiggins before the deadline just makes no sense unless something completely shocking came out of the works here in terms of, I don't know, like a legit all-star starter caliber player, which is just not going to happen. It sounds like it's Butler, it's LaVine, it's Vucevic. Now, technically, they could get in on the De'Aaron Fox stuff, but I don't think I'd even trade Wiggins to De'Aaron Fox. So, this to me, from Siegel's report, is perhaps the most intriguing and the most optimistic thing that we can point to here from a Warrior perspective in regards to Zach LaVine. And that is that the Warriors can still get to his number without giving up Andrew Wiggins, without giving up Draymond Green, without giving up young players like Jonathan Kuminga and Brandon Pajemski. So it's a really interesting hypothetical but possible scenario that Siegel has laid out here. Now to dive into what he has suggested here as a possibility is that the Warriors could orchestrate a 3-team trade that gets them LaVine and maybe Talen Horton-Tucker from the Chicago Bulls, and then they also offload salary to the Charlotte Hornets and get the likes of Nick Smith Jr., Seth Curry, and Taj Gibson in return. Now, I think when it comes to Horton-Tucker, Nick Smith Jr., Seth Curry, Taj Gibson, I don't think Warrior fans are too excited about those names, but they're not doing this trade for that reason. It's for Zach LaVine. And you have to laugh, right? You have to find this quite comical, quite humorous that the Warriors are trying to basically correct the mistake they made in the offseason. I spoke about this on the post-game live show the other day. They could have probably had Zach LaVine for Chris Paul, for Gary Payton II, and for Kevon Looney, right? And who knows? Zach LaVine's value was so low, they might have even got a pick back in return in that scenario. Now, the report came out that they rejected a deal that was Paul and Wiggins for LaVine, but that didn't really make much sense to me because Paul and Wiggins were making a combined $56 million, LaVine's only making $43. So what else was going on there? I do think the Warriors could have ultimately probably guaranteed Chris Paul's contract, taken on the luxury tax implications and the apron implications, and put Gary Payton II and Kevon Looney in that deal for Zach LaVine. They instead chose, no, we're going to waive Chris Paul. We're going to let him become a free agent for the first time in his life, and he joins the San Antonio Spurs. We're going to keep Payton. We're going to keep Looney. We're going to have this newfound flexibility in free agency where we're now going to go and get Buddy Hield. We're going to go get DeAnthony Melton, who's since turned into Dennis Schroeder, obviously, because of the injury. We're going to go get Kyle Anderson, right? So they did that, and now, 6 months or whatever later, leading into the trade deadline, they are trying to configure a deal that would see the two guys I initially mentioned in the possible Paul trade, Payton and Looney, and the guys they got in free agency, Buddy Hield, Kyle Anderson, and now Schroeder, who obviously was gotten as a result of Melton. They're trying to get those 5 players, and Siegel also mentioned Moses Moody's another possible one. So 5 of 6 players. It would take 5 players out of that 6-player group to try and get Zach LaVine to basically say, hey, we made a mistake. We don't want this depth anymore. We want the star. We want the talent. And I think Steve Kerr's comments yesterday on 95.7 The Game's Will and Divs were really revealing yesterday when he was asked about trying to balance a good culture and locker room with talent. And it was really interesting to hear, Steve say that, hey, you need talent in this league in order to win. You can't win without talent. It's not a guarantee that you're going to win, but if you don't have the talent, you're not going to get anywhere. And it's just really fascinating to hear him speak so openly about the Warriors questioning whether they've got enough talent. And I think fans and analysts around the league, we can all point and say, no, they don't have enough talent. But for Steve to come out and question that publicly, I think that's a real change in thinking, because usually we get the very same stuff from Steve Kerr at this time of the year where he's like, oh, I love our guys. I think we've got enough to compete. I think we're headed in a really good direction, blah, 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 all these cliches. And then ultimately that's kind of setting the Warriors up for not doing anything. And they move forward with what they've got. Now, this seems to be a different approach to me, where Steve's comments yesterday would seem to suggest to me that there is an imminent trade coming, that something will happen, that the Warriors do realize that they need an injection of talent here to try and support Steph Curry. So I think that's really, really important. And I think it's good to hear Steve being honest and open and saying, hey, we are actually questioning whether we've got enough talent to compete. They're currently 24-23, but they're 11th in the Western Conference this season. Has slipped away a bit, but if you look at the standings, they're still kind of close enough, particularly if they were to get a LaVine trade. Now, what does it mean for the rest of this season? If this trade was to go down right and they were to be able to get Zach LaVine, well, LaVine alleviates a lot of the issues. Now, I would have loved to get him in the offseason for a much cheaper price. Now, it's going to be interesting to see what draft capital, because the Warriors aren't just going to be able to give up 5 players, 5 average to mediocre players for Zach LaVine. They're not going to be able to do that. There'd have to be some draft capital involved. We heard from the Athletic on Wednesday that their 2025, this year's first round pick, is potentially on the table. Some lottery, or not lottery protected, but some protected version of that pick. Now, how protected it would be in a LaVine trade, I would say not a whole lot, like maybe top 3, top 5 protected. But from Chicago's perspective, LaVine's been so good this season, averaging 24 points, nearly 5 rebounds, nearly 5 assists, shooting 44.6% from three-point range. If you don't mind, on over 7 attempts per game, that is crazy, right? You would want at least a first-round pick. Now, yes, he's still got $95 million owing over the next 2 years, but I think he's been that good that he's a legitimate asset now. They would want something reasonably significant in terms of draft capital, but I just don't know, and it hasn't really been speculated too much, I don't think, about where LaVine's value actually lies. Like, this entire Siegel report, there was no mention of draft picks, I don't think, at all. Like, it was all just about the players and the salary matching. So there would have to be some picks involved, and I just don't know where LaVine's value is at. Is it one first-round pick? How protected is that first-round pick? Do you have to give up multiple first-round picks? Who knows? Do you have to give Charlotte draft capital to take on these contracts, or the Pistons, or a third team that's involved? Like, how does this shake out? We just don't know, and I'm actually just not sure where LaVine's value is. But his value to the Warriors is obviously going to be really big, because he would automatically become the second go-to scorer for Steph. I think, like, imagine having, we've seen the Warriors' offensive struggles so far this season. Imagine having a quartet of Steph, Wiggins, Kuminga, and LaVine, right? 4 guys who could all go for 20-plus points any given night. And we have really been disappointed, frustrated with the Warriors' lack of a legitimate second scorer, a guy who can average 20 points a game. I think Kuminga will get there. He just hasn't yet. And obviously the injury came at a really poor time. But all of a sudden you could have Steph, you could have LaVine, who can average 24, 25 a game. You could have Kuminga, who can average over 20. We've seen what Wiggins has been doing recently. He can average 17 to 20 points a game. So all of a sudden, the offense actually looks really, really good. And you're not necessarily having to rely on Steph to play really well in order to win. Like, Steph, he didn't have a huge scoring performance on Wednesday against the Thunder, but he had a big second half, made 5 threes, and was obviously critical in that comeback. He doesn't do that. The Warriors lose that game. They were down 10 at halftime, basically because Steph was incredibly quiet, had two points in the first half. So the reliance on Steph Curry, the nearly 37-year-old Steph Curry, is still huge. And I think bringing Zach LaVine in would alleviate that. Being able to start him in the backcourt, yeah, there's defensive concerns. We get it. But being able to have that effective backcourt partner for Steph when you've gone through so many different options this season, whether it's D'Anthony Melton to start the season, Schroeder, Lindy Waters, Pods, Gary Payton II, Buddy Hield. Like, there's just so many. They started the season trying to go big with Wiggins, Kuminga, Draymond, and TJD alongside Steph. That only lasted 3 games. Like, this stuff has been really, really frustrating for fans that we cannot have a solidified starting lineup. Now, the interesting thing here with adding LaVine is that there's still a question mark at center. Like, the Warriors right now have a question mark at the 2 guard and also the center position. Now, what do you do at the 5? Okay, Looney has been their best option recently and was huge on Wednesday. Quentin Post kind of looked like a rookie performance on Wednesday against the Thunder. Didn't look quite comfortable out there, which is fine. It wasn't really the game for him. He's been really impressive recently, otherwise, in developing into a genuine rotation role here. So that's fantastic. Do you want him starting? Not if you genuinely want to be a playoff team. Do you want TJD starting? He's out of the rotation now completely as of Wednesday against the Thunder. That's a really interesting one. I think you feel a lot more comfortable starting TJD if, like, your other 4 guys are Steph, LaVine, Wiggins, and Draymond. And that's actually, like, that talent can go toe-to-toe with most teams in the league. And therefore, you could probably get away with, Trace. And I also think maybe things get easier for Trace as well, having another guy like Zach LaVine on the team who has so much of the attention from the opposing defense focused on him that maybe things become easier for TJD. The closing lineup would instantly be excellent, you'd imagine, with Steph, LaVine, Wiggins, Kuminga, and Draymond. Like, that's just the closing lineup for the half and the end of game situations. Like, that's fantastic. We love that. But again, the center minutes, where do they come down to? You've got Quentin Post there as a possible rotation member, you'd imagine. If you look at the other bench options that the Warriors could have in this scenario, they'd still have Kuminga, obviously, Podziemski, Moody, maybe if he's like, to me, it would be the 5 other guys before Moody. Now, maybe he has some value to a team like Charlotte or something like that. Can they take on his poison pill contract? I don't know, but maybe that's a possibility. But you'd still have one of the 6 guys, I suppose. TJD would still be there. Sorry, not TJD because he's starting. Post would still be there, and also Lindy Waters, the third, would be there. And that's without including any of the guys that the Warriors could possibly get on top of LaVine, whether it's Taylor Horton-Tucker, Seth Curry, Taj Gibson, Nick Smith Jr. I should say Nick Richards would actually be really helpful in this scenario, but he's already been traded to Phoenix. So there'd be enough depth there, and then you could try, and I think the Warriors would still have access to being able to sign buyout guys, which I think would be really important. Maybe there's a buyout guy, particularly at the point guard spot. I've spoken about a lot lately about Schroeder and his impact on Podziemski and how much easier he's made it for Brandon Podziemski and not having to be the backup point guard off the bench, and that would be a concern for me, right, if they made this LaVine trade. But at the same time, it's like, well, if you can make this trade of 5 pretty average players for a real like all-star caliber offensive talent, then you probably just have to work it out later. Like, you just have to make that trade. And I'm of that belief. Like, I think the Warriors should make, if this was on the table and the Warriors can essentially gut their depth for Zach LaVine, I think it's worth it. Okay, because I think they've shown they're pretty good at filling out the remainder of the roster. Like, if Lindy Waters has to get some minutes, then Lindy Waters has to get some minutes. Like, I don't hate that. I don't hate Lindy Waters. I don't love him. I don't think he should be necessarily part of the rotation based on the current roster, and he hasn't been. I think that's the right decision. But if they gut their depth and Lindy Waters is all of a sudden accelerated from the 13th or 14th guy on the roster to the 9th guy on the roster, fine. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. They're still going to have Guy Santos in this scenario as well. Like, Guy's clearly shown recently he's capable of playing 20 minutes a game. Like, there'd still be some depth left over even before we get to what else they'd get in the LaVine trade and what they could potentially get in the buyout market. They'd convert Post from a 2-way contract to a standard deal, you'd imagine. Maybe they look at a guy like Kevin Knox II, who I've spoken about as a player who's been killing it in the G League recently. So, to me, there would still be enough there to have reasonable depth. And I think I've been critical of Mike Dunleavy Jr., but what I will give him credit for is that he generally fills out the roster really well in terms of a smart trade for Lindy Waters III. Again, I don't love him as a player, but I don't mind him. Like, he's okay. Like, if you just replace Buddy Hield with Lindy Waters III right now, would you see too much of a downgrade? I don't think so. Like, I don't think you would. In terms of, obviously, his drafting with TJD and Post in the 50s, excellent work. Excellent. Pods at 19, excellent. Right? There's been no issues here with the Warriors being able to get really good depth pieces. It's just the top end of the roster, and I think it's about time that they finally say, hey, let's use some of this depth to go and get an all-star caliber offensive player like a Zach LaVine. Okay? Again, I'm frustrated they didn't do it during the offseason, but they seem to be wanting to correct their mistake now. Now, the interesting thing here is moving forward, obviously, because you get LaVine and then you've got Jonathan Kuminga's restricted free agency coming up during the offseason. And clearly, if you do not trade Jonathan Kuminga in the next week, you're essentially wedding yourself to him. You are deciding, we are in partnership here for at least the next few years. In terms of, you could always trade him, but in terms of contractual situation, and they are going to have to be they're going to have to be open to offering Kuminga whatever he gets as an offer sheet from another team. Now, maybe there's a perspective here from the Warriors that, hey, if the Brooklyn Nets, who are really the team with the most cap room, if they do not provide you an offer sheet, if they're not interested, right, then there's not going to be too many other teams around the league that will be, and therefore maybe we could actually get you at a significant discount. Maybe we could get you at $20 million a season, and that would be really good for the Warriors. Otherwise, if Brooklyn are interested in, say, to Jonathan Kuminga, here's an offer sheet at $30 million a year, the Warriors, you can't do what they've done with Kuminga in terms of being up and down with his rotation role, but more so off the court in terms of they've had plenty of opportunities where they could have traded him, they haven't. if they keep him beyond this deadline, like, you just have to re-sign him in restricted free agency. You can't let him walk for nothing. You cannot do that. You can't possibly. It would be the worst look ever, really, if you had all this opportunity to trade him in 4 years and then you decided, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to let him walk in restricted free agency. I don't care how you try and spin that. It would be a disaster. It would be. And so you're at his mercy and saying, okay, whatever you get in an offer sheet, we're going to match automatically, whatever it is. Okay, so to me, that's what you have to do. What you're left over with moving forward into next season, let's have a look at the payroll. Steph's making 59.6. Lavine's making 46 next season. Let's say you get Kuminga for 30, right? $30 million. Wiggins, 28.2. Draymond, 25.9. And then you'd have under contract Trace at 2.2, Pods at 3.7. That's $195.6 million with 7 players. Okay, the second apron is projected to be at $207.8 million. So essentially, they'd have to try and figure out a way to, you can have 14 on the roster, so another 7 players on minimum contracts, and even then, they're probably not going to be able to get under the second apron. Maybe there's a way in which they can give Kuminga his, 4-year, $120 million deal, average $30 million a year, but the first year is only like 26 or 27 or something like that, and that gives them a few $1 million in which to work with to be able to fill out the remainder of the roster and try and get under the second apron. Maybe it's a situation where Joe Lacob's like, bugger it, I'll go over the second apron again. Stuff it. Let's do it. Well, not again because he's not there this season, but obviously in previous years, if there was a second apron in place, the Warriors would have been over it a significant number of times. Maybe he's just like, yeah, stuff it. I'll do what it takes money-wise. Steph's 37. And that would be great if he did that, but there are the implications of that in terms of the flexibility. The other player I didn't mention in that payroll is Moody. Right, Moody's about to start a contract where he's making near, $12 million a year basically from next season. So in that scenario, you just couldn't keep Moses Moody. You'd just be like, I know we're signing this extension, but we're going to have to get rid of you. And maybe you'd actually have to give up assets to get off his contract in that situation. Who knows, right? Would you have a first-round pick this year to get a guy on a rookie contract? Who knows? So this is the stuff that the Warriors, this Lavine stuff. Yes, you look at the roster right now and for the rest of this season and you decide, okay, do we have enough talent? No, then we might need to make the trade. But you've also got to look at it from the long-term implications and say, this guy's got basically $95 million owing over the next 2 years. This is what it does to us. This is the scenario if Kuminga comes back on $30 million a year. And this is all the stuff. These are all the conversations. And this is the difficulty of it, is that you've got a week to decide here what you want to do. And what happens in the next week could really have implications that obviously not only for the rest of this season, not only for next season, it could have implications for 4, 5, 6, 10 years, right? The decisions you make in the next week, okay? And that's why, we as fans get frustrated sometimes about the lack of decision-making, I suppose, or the indecision or the inactivity, I suppose. And, Mike Dunleavy Jr. and Steve and Joe Lacob, whoever, coming out and saying, trades are hard, trades aren't easy, okay? And I think there's plenty of right reasoning to be frustrated as from a fan's perspective, but I also think it's worth noting, hey, these decisions have to be meticulously thought out and decided upon, and there's a lot of stuff that goes into this, not just from a short term, but a long-term perspective that again could stretch out as far as 6 to 8 to 10 years, because you've got guys on this roster who you want for that long. You want Jonathan Kuminga ideally to be a player for the Warriors for the next 10 years. You want Brandon Bajemski, maybe even Moody, okay? You want these guys to be long-term players. Lavine, if you trade for Lavine, you don't necessarily want Lavine just for his, the rest of this season, his next 2 years. You might want him beyond that. He's only going to be 31, 32 at the end of his contract. You might want him beyond that. So there's so many different things, so many different players are involved in this that it's super fascinating to see what the Warriors are going to do here. But Siegel did end his report by saying, nonetheless, talks of Lavine heading to Golden State are very real and gaining momentum. So we could see Zach LaVine on the Warriors in the next week. I hope we do. I just hope we don't see it for Andrew Wiggins. Again, I'm going to be sad. I'm going to be disappointed if the likes of, I think GP2 and Looney are the two big ones because they are championship members of this organization. They are beloved members of this organization. If they depart, that's going to be sad. But in terms of just the injection of talent and the Warriors being a better basketball team, I think they would be better as a result of this trade. And as Siegel mentioned in his report, the Warriors would have interest in bringing back GP2 and Looney in free agency, right? Potentially on those minimum contracts, right? So we'll just wait and see what happens. There's going to be plenty going on here over the next week. Plenty of updates, which I'm sure I'll get you guys across and discuss on our post-game live shows as we move forward here. I'll also have a couple other podcast episodes. There's going to be so much going on. You can check out my work over at bluemanhoop.com as well. Other than that, guys, I'm going to finish it up there. Let me know what you think. Do you want Zach LaVine on the Warriors? Do you like the idea of this trade with 5 players potentially going out? GP2, Looney, Buddy, Slow-Mo, and also Dennis Schroeder, who of course isn't trade eligible till February 5, so we couldn't see a deal like this until February 5 at the earliest. Just let me know in the YouTube comments. Thanks again for tuning in. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel already, that'd be greatly appreciated. You can follow me at POK252, that's POK252 on X/Twitter. We're also on Instagram, TikTok, Golden State with Mates. Let's hope the Warriors can get another victory later today against the Phoenix Suns. That would be huge, and I'm sure we'll speak between now and the game against the Magic, I think, which is coming up on Monday. A nice little stretch of home games here for the Warriors to try and get some momentum, but who knows? The whole roster could be shaken up with a massive Zach LaVine trade ahead of the deadline. Thanks again, guys.